course, vortex manipulator, one of the few props I don't actually have. So folks, this is going to be the inaugural episode of what will be an occasional sort of sub-series when I talk about Doctor Who, which is going to be Doctor Who dangling plot threads, or at least dangling at the time that I record them, because given the nature of Doctor Who, any of these can be picked up at any time. So there were a number of things that I was considering talking about. I tossed them out to the folks over on my Patreon. Get that plug in there. Help me out. And they selected out of the options I gave them for me to today talk about the Time Agency. Now, when I talk about this, and also in the future when I talk about dangling plot threads, I'm going to be focusing on the shows, because I know that talking about this, or if I ever talk about things like Jenny the Doctor's Daughter, or New Paradigm Daleks, or anything else I would consider to be a dangling plot thread, that many, if not all of these, have been picked up and expanded on in novels, comics, audio, etc. I'm not counting any of that. Not because I don't think it's good or doesn't deserve attention or anything like that, but because the simple truth is, the canon is the show. And while the books, comics, audio, etc. do try to fit within the canon of the show, that courtesy doesn't extend the same way. The show does not and won't care if it does something that contradicts something that was in an audio before. It's going to do its own thing, to the point that they've taken some of the audio stories and adapted them directly, and same with some of the novels. So the respect for canon only goes in one direction. So keeping that in mind, and keeping in mind that I am aware this stuff has been expanded on in extra media, but I'm not talking about that. What is the Time Agency? What do we know about it within the context of the show? When was it introduced? What could be done with it that isn't being done with it? So, stick with me. I'm going to say something that some folks are going to be like, wait! I'll get there. So, the Time Agency was effectively introduced when we met Captain Jack Harkness, who was a rogue time agent. He was a former time agent, now working as a con man. Technically, the idea of time agents was dropped prior to that, but that's the thing I will come back to, so just stick with me here. So what we learned at that time was not a lot. We knew, they used the vortex manipulators to get around. We know that the Time Agency wiped 2 years from Jack's memory. He, to the best of my knowledge, at least in the shows, if it came up in the other stuff, I don't know, but as far as the shows go, which is the canon, he never found out what that 2 years was. He never got it back. But realizing that they did that to him is what caused him to leave and basically go out and do his own thing. The extent to which the Time Agency has come up since then has been very limited and very offhanded. Within Torchwood, we had the introduction of Captain John Hart, who also was a former time agent, actually was Jack's partner for a time. And we have had references to time agents usually as an explanation for where somebody got a vortex manipulator from. So we know that they are the source of those things. And more to the point, they seem to be really bad at keeping track of them, because their rogue agents have them, and people like what was his name, Krasko has it, and River Song gets her hands on one. Like, these seem oddly easy to get a hold of for an agency that, by its name, you would think is trying to police time travel. And that's sort of the next thing. What is the Time Agency? Well, exactly what is a little bit fuzzy, because we've never actually seen it in the show. One would guess, and I do know enough to know this is supported by the supplementary material, that it sort of came about when the Time Lords vanished, and basically nobody was monitoring or keeping track of what the effects of time travel was having on the world as a whole. Somebody had to fill the vacuum, so it was the Time Agency. Now, part of the reason I found myself thinking about this is because I watch Legends of Tomorrow, and there is I think it's the Time Bureau in that. And I found myself watching that going, is this basically what the Time Agency would have been like on Doctor Who if we ever got to see it? And that's kind of my default headcanon. It's a group that is monitoring, doing their best, probably in a little over their heads, could be doing it better, but There's nobody else doing it right now. Now, some folks might point out that, well, there's nowhere to go with this because in his appearance in the Series 2 opener for Torchwood, John Hart says that the Time Agency has been disbanded. Well, a couple things about that. The first is, the entire rest of that episode basically demonstrates why we can and should never, ever, ever trust anything this guy says. So the information he gives on that is immediately suspect and shouldn't be taken at face value. But even if he's telling the truth, that leaves its own dangling plot thread, because what he says is it was disbanded. There was basically 7 of us, meaning 7 other time agents left. So that's still a dangling plot thread, because if somebody's disbanded, what do you mean there's 7 time agents left? There are 7 people left who were part of it, but now they're doing whatever? Or are there 7 people acting as independent contractors with no longer a central governing authority because the time agency is gone? That's still something that could be picked on and worked with. Now, it's also worth pointing out that even if the time agency is quote-unquote gone, that doesn't mean anything because they travel through time. So they, even if, like, say in the 65th century they were disbanded, doesn't matter, because the version of the agency from the 58th century can still travel to a way later point in time, so we can still run into them. There's no reason for them not to show up. Now, I mentioned that the time agency has actually gotten a mention prior to this, and this is also, again, one of the things that got expanded on further in supplementary materials. But technically, the first mention of the Time Agency is from a classic Doctor Who story, a 4th Doctor story called The Talons of Weng-Chiang. Now, in that, the villain mistakes the Doctor for a time agent. Now, that's kind of all we get from that story. My presumption, based off the context of that, wasn't that the Time Agency was a completely different thing, but that it was like something within Gallifrey society. Like Time Lords, Time Agents, all sort of under the umbrella of Gallifrey. Whether or not that was intended to be the case doesn't really matter, because it was so loose then that they could mold it into whatever they were going to have it be later. But that does introduce the idea that the Time Agency was, if not around at an earlier point, at the very least because of time travel shenanigans, mucking around with stuff well ahead of when we met Captain Jack Harkness. So again, that opens up the possibility of injecting them into stuff where there's really no reason that they couldn't be. So the question becomes, why haven't they done anything with this? Which does strike me as a little bit odd. I suppose there's probably a couple reasons. The first is, part of what keeps Doctor Who followable is because even as we are jumping all over points of time and everything else, we are sticking with the Doctor, and we are constant with the Doctor on the Doctor's own chronology. You start introducing other time travelers into that who are on their own separate chronology, and things get complicated fairly quickly. I mean, we've already seen what can happen with that with River Song. Whether you love her or hate her, or love the way that her story was done, or don't like the way her story was done, you can't deny it was complicated. And trying to take an agency of theoretically multiple people and weave it into the story in a similar manner to how River Song was, yeah, that's going to get messy quickly. But only if they try to make them like a thing, like a regularly appearing thing. And there's no need to do that. But I think it would be interesting if every now and then, if the Doctor ran into a time agent who basically considers the Doctor to be a menace, considers the Doctor to be an amateur because he's not answering to anybody and he doesn't have the bureaucratic structure behind him, or that the Doctor gets annoyed with him and is like, I've been doing this a lot longer than you, back off. I'd kind of love to see the headbutting that would happen if a time agent crossed with the Doctor and they were both trying to deal with the same thing, and maybe they disagreed as to what the resolution should be or something like that. Again, I'm not sure it should necessarily be an ongoing thing, but like, there's a lot of meat to be mined off that. I'm mixing my metaphors here. But, you know, just as a one-off, you could totally do that. And not to mention, like I said, that's a pretty big dangling thread with never having found out what Jack's 2-year gap was about. At this point, I would not expect that to ever get addressed in the show, because I don't expect Jack to come back at this point. He was gone for the entirety of of 11's run and 12, and now we're into 13. Like, it's not impossible. There's no reason he can't come back, but I'm not holding my breath for it at this point, and unless they do, there's no reason to address that. Now, if they ever do bring Captain Jack back, I would kind of like to see that addressed, because it was set up like from his very first appearance. Yet, and it really felt like it was being set up as something to be addressed later. And never was. Then again, part of me wonders if at this point, since it's been so long since that got introduced, is there anything that the answer could be that wouldn't come off as a bit of an anticlimax, a bit of a disappointment? I don't know. It's just interesting to me that the Time Agency feels like it's a toy in the toy box that nobody's touching, and everybody's choosing to work around, but it's there. It's right there. And like, especially with something like, because they introduced the Shadow Proclamation in Series 4. It might have gotten a mention earlier, but we actually saw them in Series 4, and I found them deeply underwhelming. I'm like, you are boring and generic, and what are you here? Like, why couldn't that have been the Time Agency? Something we had heard of since Series 1 of this show coming back. Something that had an origin of sorts in the classic era, as opposed to this weird albino lady and her hired rhino goons. Like, that's okay. I think it would have fit much better to have that have been the Time Agency, or any other time that just an authority has come up. I mean, we've seen the storm cages. Does the Time Agency run those? It would make sense, but we've never really had a confirmation with that. There's a slight connection in that, you know, people who have showed up later with their hands on vortex manipulators have spent time in time cages, but again, the actual connection has never been made explicit. And normally, I make the complaint that with a show like Doctor Who, you shouldn't be bringing back the same stuff too much because it makes the universe seem small. Like, at a point, it's very weird that the Doctor keeps running into the same people over and over and over again. Or like how I don't like how the Doctor has a myth like across the universe because he saved so many planets. I'm like, I'm sorry, I don't care how many planets he's saved. There's an infinite number of them. Not this many should be aware of him. So I've made that complaint before, but with the Time Agency, I think there's a bit more wiggle room because since it moves about in time the same way that the Doctor does, it makes sense for them to pop up in more places in a way that doesn't make sense for characters who are stuck on a singular timeline to keep turning up over and over and over again. So I just think it would be really interesting to see what somebody could do with this. And like I said, don't build a thing out of it. Don't make like a series arc out of it, but have it in there for a bit of fun. Because I think there's potential there. And again, my notion of the Time Agency is more on the fun side, again, because I've kind of projected the Legends of Tomorrow Time Agency into this, and that's fun! But that's my hope. That's a dangling plot thread that I kind of wish somebody would pull on, do something with. What are your thoughts about the Time Agency? What are all the stuff going on in the supplementary material that I don't know about and you're going to completely lay out for me? Whatever you want to tell me, drop it down in the comments. Let's talk about it. There's stuff to do. If you want to support me, help me pay my bills, I've got a Patreon. There's also the subscribe, the like. The like has been a big help lately. You folks have been hitting it, and I do appreciate it. Bunch of other stuff to do down there besides, but you don't have to do it if you don't want to. At the end of the day, folks, you're the council, I'm just running the meetings, and until next time, this council is adjourned.